Yeah, hello everybody. This is another paper discussion, actually the fourth paper on narrative visualization. And I found a very interesting book chapter that I want to comment on. It's entitled Narrative Design Patterns for Data-Driven Storytelling. So that's really a quite fundamental work. It introduces 18 patterns. Pattern is a term that's used quite frequently in computer science. We will see some other applications of this. Patterns are quite high level, but they can provide guidance, orientation, and structure. These 18 patterns are categorized, so in total there are 5 categories for these patterns. And this book chapter was written by a set of authors that's really impressive. Yeah, not only that's a long list of authors that collaborated here in a discussion at the Dachstuhl seminar, but these are really persons that complement each other very well. So Benjamin Bach is the first author here, the lead author. He is an expert for many things, but with respect to narrative visualization, primarily for data comics. Yeah, I want not to comment on all of them, but a few. Steven Drucker is a researcher with broad research experiences in many areas of computer graphics, visualization, information visualization, and also narrative visualization. So I remember from my master thesis 30 years before having looked at a paper from him on intelligent camera control. Also something that would be applicable for narrative visualization. Lynn Bartram is a famous researcher for the use of motion in user interfaces, but also for other aspects of perception and cognition in user interfaces. Ulrike Köppen is not so much known as a scientist, but she is a very professional data journalist. So she can contribute a lot of very practical experience. And Barbara Tversky is famous for her work on animation, on cognitive aspects of animation, perceptual aspects. So she dealt a lot with the question, is animation something very useful to convey information for learning purposes, for example, or not? Yeah. So based on this set of authors, one really can expect some fundamental and important work. The outline of this talk is as follows. Of course, I shortly want to introduce the topic and then present the 5 categories of narrative patterns, and then we'll go on a little bit more in detail to the specific narrative patterns. I've said already these are 18, and that all would be too abstract without any examples, so I will present some of them that were part of this book chapter, and as always speculate a little bit of what could be medical examples. What is a pattern in a computer science sense? A pattern is something that is rather high level. Yeah, that means if there is a pattern, then there are different ways how to implement this. Not only because there are different programming languages, but even at a higher level, there are different variants how you could realize a pattern. But nevertheless, they provide useful guidance and orientation. Probably the most well-known example in computer science are design patterns for software development. Yeah, the singleton pattern or the subject observer pattern. Yeah, so there is an instance of one class and an instance from another class that automatically gets notified if the subject changes and then can trigger some reaction to this. Yeah, so that would be a software design pattern. It's realized in different ways, in different object-oriented languages, but the pattern is the same. And based on software design patterns, I think it was Jan Borchers who came up first with user interface patterns, and there are also visualization patterns, and yeah, a little bit similar, one can think of patterns for narration. So patterns here provide guidance to connect the form of narration with the intent of the story. So you see I make a quote here, so that's a direct citation from this book chapter. Yeah, the authors discussed a while at Dachstuhl and later when writing this book chapter, and after a lot of discussion, they came up with 18 papers grouped according to 5 categories. Of course, if you see something like this, you may always ask yourself, can we be really sure that there is not a pattern number 19 and 20? Can we be really sure whether there is a 6th category or a 7th category? You cannot be completely sure, but I really thought about, could I add something, either a pattern or a category? I could not, yeah? So probably that is a quite reasonable basis and a quite stable basis for narrative visualization. So that's the overview, yeah? We have 18 patterns: addressing the audience, breaking the fourth wall, call to action, compare, concretize, and so on. I think that's an alphabetic order here, yeah, not a semantic order. And then there are 5 different categories. By the way, that's not a lexicographic order, yeah. So argumentation, for example, is supported by the specific pattern compare, and by concretize, and also by repetition, and by asking rhetorical questions. Yeah, almost by definition, I would say a rhetorical question should trigger reasoning, and that is an essential part of argumentation. Yeah, so we see that there are even more patterns for increasing viewer engagement. Yeah, if I count correctly, there are 8 patterns from the 18, almost every second one, that's for viewer engagement. And even more, if I count correctly, it's 10 for emotion. Yeah, so argumentation is more the rational part of understanding and cognition. Emotion and engagement, are supported by even more patterns. So some patterns just serve one purpose. Yeah, for example, comparing or call to action. Call to action is for engagement. Yeah, so the user should be aware that his lifestyle is too risky, for example, and should change something, for example, do more exercises. And comparing, on the other hand, that's more on the rational side, so that does not trigger emotions, but it serves for argumentation. So these two are just for one purpose, whereas some others, as you see here, are for 2, 3, or in this case, rhetorical questions, even for 4 different purposes. Yeah, so rhetorical question is also useful for framing, thus for controlling to some extent the expectations of the viewer, and rhetorical questions also address emotion and engagement. So that makes them very useful. So there was one term that I had to look up. I was not familiar with this. Breaking the fourth wall. What on the heck is the fourth wall? That's a convention from the theater. Yeah, there is the stage, and the stage has 3 walls. Yeah, behind the actors and the left and right wall, and then there is an invisible 4th wall that is only you can only look through this wall in one direction. That's the convention. The audience can see the actors, but the actors do not perceive the audience. Yeah, they could see them, of course, theoretically, but they stay on the stage, they stay focused there, they focus on their own performance and on the other actors, but not on the audience. Yeah, there is no interaction between the actors in theater and the audience. And that is something that's not useful here. There should be some interaction, and therefore breaking the 4th wall is a useful strategy. So the authors came up with cards. Yeah, for each pattern, a card is designed, and this contains two aspects. Yeah, for all these 18 patterns: the how and the why. Yeah. So, for example, incorporating the audience, how audience becomes part of the narrative. So that definitely includes some interaction. Yeah. Why? It increases empathy, facilitate personal comparisons, helps make the data and information more personally relevant to allow the reader to use herself as a measuring device. Yeah. So, for example, you specify your blood pressure, your weight, and other variables characterizing your situation, and then the system presents information that fits to your situation. Yeah, or repetition. Yeah, repetition is really important. Facts that you want to make sure that users understand and remember it should be presented in different ways several times. And that's explained here. A phenomenon is represented multiple times with changes to the main variable or dimension, or the time frame or the animation pattern. Yeah, and then there is the why. There is a third component here, and that's an example that's linked here. So you could link on examples in order to better understand this pattern. And we see the colors here again. These are the different purposes, the same that we have seen on the last slide: argument, flow, framing, engagement, and empathy. Yeah, what are patterns for argumentation? So I go through these 5 purposes, right? First, a quote again. What is argumentation? A process of reasoning systematically in support of an idea, action, or theory. And there are 4 patterns for this. I briefly commented them already in the overview image. Comparison. So you compare often 2 data sets, to graphs, for example, if there is a development over time, maybe even a bit more. Yeah, so not only 2, but 3, 4, 5, but probably not 10. Yeah, that would result in visual clutter, and it is difficult to understand, in particular for a broad audience that is not familiar with complex visualizations. So, for example, you could see the development of persons dying from corona over time compared with the overall number of persons dying in a particular region. And that would tell you whether the number of people dying from corona adds to the number of people dying usually or not. Yeah, if not, you may suppose, well, people may actually have died from something differently, and just corona was a second diagnosis, not so important. Yeah, so that could be a way how you could reason based on a comparison. Concretize means to use symbols for each data object. Yeah, an abstract visualization would be something like a scatter plot, where you have just the dots in the scatter plot. That's quite abstract. Yeah, when you concretize, you would present something that is easier to imagine, that's more concrete. We have seen, for example, these pictographs in several examples of the previous videos, where a stylized human is shown and data is mapped on this stylized human. That would be a very specific way of realizing the concretized pattern. Repetition, already mentioned, typically not in the sense that you repeat something exactly the same way as you did it before, but you do this from a slightly different perspective or using different visualization techniques, so that multiple flows of argumentation may converge. Yeah? And rhetorical questions trigger analytical reasoning, and therefore also serve for argumentation. Yeah, examples for comparison in medical data. So, for example, you could compare how a disease affects women and men, how it affects different regions or countries, how it affects different age groups, how it affects people that are vaccinated or not vaccinated, had certain previous diseases or not. Yeah, if you only think of the corona pandemics, you know that all these kinds of comparisons are somehow interesting and are used in order to understand the effects of this disease. Yeah, you could also compare not only the incidence of a disease, for example, between one region and another one, but between one region and the overall average. Yeah, so that you see how different certain regions, age groups, or whatever are from the global average. Yeah, is this something spectacularly different, with a prominent difference, or is this number in absolute numbers quite high, but compared to the average not so surprising? Here's an example for concretization, and that is again from this isotype picture language that goes back to Otto Neurath from the 1930s. Yeah, so that should illustrate here people that took part as soldiers in World War I, and these soldiers, yeah, fortunately, most of them went home without being wounded or killed. Yeah, but of course, a considerable number were wounded. These are the red icons here, or killed. That is symbolized here with this black icon. Yeah, and you get a good understanding of these proportion. Yeah, each figure here represents 1 million of soldiers. So this scaling, of course, is important. Yeah, if it would represent 10 million of soldiers, then you would have, yeah, just one of this category and maybe 3 or 4 of this category. That's not enough. Yeah. However, when each figure would represent only 10,000 of soldiers, you would get too many of these symbols. Yeah. So that is what needs to be taken into account. What are patterns for flow, and what is the flow? Yeah, that's the structure of sequencing messages and arguments. It serves to guide the audience to portions of the data. So you may emphasize one region, then you change the camera, maybe with panning over a map, then you zoom into another area or emphasize another area with a different color or an arrow or so, and present the information for this region or subset of the data. Speed can be quite important. So imagine you show in development over time in an animation. Then there are periods where not so much happened. Yeah, in mathematical terms, where the gradient with respect to the displayed information is small. Then you may slightly slow down, probably not abruptly. Yeah, probably the speed goes down continuously. And then there may be periods where many things happen in a short period of time. Yeah, sometimes you have the impression that history is really compressed in certain periods of time, and then you would change the speed in the other direction. Yeah. So that is something that is possible. An essential example is the world development over the last 200 years as presented by Hans Rosling's Gapminder. Yeah, what are patterns for framing the narrative? Yeah, framing provides a kind of anchor information, and the information that is presented in the following is perceived with respect to the framing, yeah, to a baseline information, for example. Yeah, it's quite important for the perception of data facts, and with respect to narrative visualization, that was so carefully and deeply analyzed by Jessica Hullman. Often framing is based on anticipated expectations. So you should know your audience, as discussed in the last video, and so you can anticipate their expectations. You can also deliberately go against it. So, for example, to make the audience aware of their misjudgment. Yeah, you may know that typically people underestimate or overestimate something in a strong way, and in the framing process, you make them aware of this. One example is to make users make a guess and then show the true answer. Yeah, and it is known that this increases both the comprehension of the data and the memorability. Yeah, if you should make a guess and your guess strongly deviates from the truth, that increases the likelihood that you will remember the situation. Yeah? Let me give you an example with a medical background. If you ask people to guess the life expectancy of a woman that is already 80 years old, then people typically say something like 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. So a very low life expectancy. They may know that the life expectancy of a newborn child is slightly above 80 years for women in most Western countries. Yeah? But if a woman already is 80 years old, then her life expectancy is more in the range of 8 to 9 years and not 2 to 3 years. Yeah? So that's meant here with most people underestimate this. Concretize is an argument pattern and used to reveal what's behind the elements of a diagram. Yeah? The humans behind these dots, the animals behind the dots, but also physical objects that can be characterized. Yeah? For example, broken cars in case of car accidents. Photos could be used, short descriptions, and slow down may also trigger emotion. That's another pattern, another one of the 18. Patterns for engagement. Rhetorical questions, we already discussed them as useful for argumentation, but they are also useful for emotion and for engagement. So here are examples of rhetorical questions that indeed were used for narration. Yeah? So there is a story, I forgot in which newspaper, can you live on the minimum wage? Yeah? And then it becomes very concrete what that would mean, what you can afford and what all you can not afford. And many people are used to afford things that they could not afford when they had to live with the minimum wage. Or what's really warming the world? Yeah? A question that makes it interesting, raises interest. Perhaps there are some natural changes and it's not the human-related behavior. That is what you could think if you get confronted with such a question. Active engagement is another engagement pattern based on interaction with the data. So for example, in medicine, you could compute your risk for getting a disease or for getting a disease early or getting a disease in a particular severe manner, given your current lifestyle. Yeah? And the interaction then relates to you. You have to input variables characterizing your lifestyle. Yeah? Or you can compare yourself with the average or special groups. Yeah? So for example, where is your income related to the overall distribution of income? That's, by the way, also something where most people would be astonished that they are either poorer than they expected or richer than they expected. So most people tend to think, my income is above average. Yeah, that's what most people think, even people where the income is strongly above the average or strongly below the average. We tend to think we are somewhere in the middle. Yeah, make a guess questions. That would reveal the mismatch between the perception of the audience and the truth. I gave already examples with the life expectancy of elderly women, for example. For elderly men, this would work as well. And that also serves as framing for subsequent exploration. And then there is gaming and simulations, and that, of course, involves a really high degree of engagement, or the authors even wrote the highest degree of engagement. Yeah, gaming really is something that captivates you. You want to win in the game, you want to make progress, you want to be better than others in a kind of scoring list, you want to reach a new level or new room or whatever. Yeah, and if this can be combined with getting to know information, that could be a quite useful strategy for engagement. So here's an example for make a guess questions. For every 100 girls aged under 18 in 2014, how many became pregnant? This is all conceptions for girls per 100, where the girls are aged 15 to 17. Use the slider to make your guess. Yeah, and the person here guessed 4, and the actual number is 2.5. And the feedback from the system is you are not too far away, but you've gone a bit too high. By the way, that is taken from the paper that I presented in the last video from Stephen Drucker and colleagues from another book chapter of the same book. Yeah, so not from the paper that I want to introduce here. Other examples, US depth, yeah, that should be presented and shown in such a way that politicians are motivated to reduce the depth. Yeah, so call for action. Visualization of the depth was realized as skyscrapers, enormous skyscrapers. Yeah, so the height of the depth and how this develops over time was mapped to the height of skyscrapers. That's the way they concretized this. Or what's really warming the world, a story that I already briefly mentioned. So here, all possible natural changes are presented, yeah, such as changes in sun activity and its influence. And then there is the visualization of the greenhouse gases and their strong influence. So it immediately becomes clear that this is the most important reason for warming the world. Yeah. So in a similar way, you could imagine stories like what's really causing cancer or a stroke or an infarct. Yeah, some serious diseases that you really don't want to have and that you don't want your relatives to have. So it could be interesting if you read a headline like this to understand the narration and the story behind it. Yeah, so what's the take-home message here? For a wide variety of videos and also other kinds of narration, a similar set of narrative patterns was identified. Yeah, given the very large variety of available stories, it's surprising, I would say, that 18 patterns are sufficient to describe the large majority of them, if not even more. Yeah. Viewer engagement is an essential category and emotion as well. Yeah, we have seen that from the 18 patterns, 8 or 10 relate to these more emotional categories. So it's not enough that something is rationally done and explained very well. You need to win the emotions of the audience as well. Yeah. So there are established patterns for framing, for creating empathy, for reasoning, and for the flow. Yeah, some research questions we think about in our group. Is there a need for new patterns for narrative medical visualization? Or can we make existing patterns more concrete for medical applications, that we can provide guidance how to use these patterns? Yeah, and this could be achieved by a comprehensive analysis of medical blogs and YouTube videos. And also journals have online versions, and they often have a health sector, typically with videos that are often done in a quite careful manner. And these could be analyzed in order to answer these two questions. Yeah, so I thought about perhaps a research paper, an analysis of narrative patterns in stories about medical diagnosis and treatment. Yeah, here as always the list of references that I used for this talk. I introduced this paper, yeah, Narrative Design Patterns for Data-Driven Storytelling from Benjamin Bach and colleagues, a chapter in this book on data-driven storytelling. Yeah, quite comprehensive, 26 pages. I mentioned one other chapter of this book, namely the paper that I introduced before. And I mentioned the paper from Jessica Hullman and Nicholas Diakopoulos, Visualization Rhetoric, Framing Effects in Narrative Visualization. That was, yeah, I would say a pioneering work already in 2011 that was used here for reasoning about patterns for narration. Yeah, with this I want to thank you for your attention.